Now we move on to a panel discussion, so stay put behind your computers or screens, and also you here at Grand Hotel. And I'd like to welcome 3 experts we have with us, people to talk about Sweden's ability to create tomorrow's successful companies within the life science sector. So warm welcome to Linus Jönsson. He's Associate Professor at Karolinska Institutet. And also Björn Olander, PhD Equity Research Analyst at Murgata Equity Research. And we also have with us Aniansson, CFO and Investment Director at Karolinska Development. So please take a seat. There we go.
Thank you.
All right. Welcome to Grand Hotel and to the Naventus Life Science Summit.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Recently, investments in this life science sector has been indeed great. But how would you say the Swedish companies are faring compared to the global ones on the global market? Which area in the life science sector is the most interesting from your perspective? And any of you can answer, please.
Please go ahead.
Okay. Well, first of all, thanks for having me. We have obviously a lot of very interesting innovation happening in Sweden. We have about new targets, new companies, new drugs. I think a really interesting aspect that I would add to that is innovation in the way that we are developing pharmaceuticals. So how we are approaching conducting clinical trials and generating the evidence for new pharmaceuticals. And I think here Sweden really has a fantastic opportunity. If you take, for example, the presentation we just heard about Alzheimer's disease. So developing drugs for Alzheimer's disease is really challenging and takes a long time. And even with the trials that we do today, we don't find out if these drugs really prevent dementia. We only get really short-term outcomes. In Sweden, we have fantastic registries. For example, our Swedish dementia registry is the biggest in the world. By leveraging those type of resources, we could actually potentially develop these type of drugs in a way that gives us answers to the questions that we as doctors and clinicians really want to find out. Do these drugs really prevent dementia development? And we can potentially do that much cheaper also than with the traditional clinical trial development. So I think that's a super interesting area for development that can combine our resources in terms of data, registries, and also digitalization and technology skills. So that, I think, is an opportunity for Sweden.
And this goes for other medical conditions apart from dementia?
Absolutely. So I think the most prominent example is in cardiology, where this is actually already happening. There's been some really world-class studies done that, for example, showed in Sweden that you don't have to use oxygen when you're having a myocardial infarction, a heart attack. That has no effect. We show that in Swedish registries. So really interesting research coming through those type of studies.
Thank you very much. Would you like to add?
Yeah, I mean, in addition to the drug development and that sort of infrastructure we have in Sweden that is quite favorable, you can also point out that we have more than 200 companies in the sector listed in Sweden today. So there are many leading companies also among more mature medtech companies and so on that is actually belongs to the best in the world. And that creates a very interesting ecosystem for both the financial market but also from a financing and a scientific point of view as well.
How important is the clustering, for instance, the Medicum Valley setup in Lund and Malmö?
It's important because I mean it attracts competence and educated persons and experiences. I mean, even if they don't work together, it creates an environment that is quite good for innovation. Having said that, many companies today are quite virtual, so it is possible to have those types of connections even if you're not neighboring to another company. So the networking effect is the most important thing, not the location, I would say. But it is an advantage.
Thank you. Per, what is your response to my initial question here?
I totally agree with what you've said. I think a couple of things I'd like to add is lärarundantaget, the exemption that actually professors in the education system have the right to their innovations. That's really unique in the world. Other places is university that actually owns the IPs. That's a big advantage because that opens up for starting entrepreneurial new companies.
And do we see this happening? We do.
Yeah, all the time. That's where we find our deal flow, basically. And then I would also like to add I think we have a very cost-efficient way of developing, going back to what you mentioned here, compared to what we see elsewhere, especially in the US, the capital required is almost a factor 5 or 10 less to accomplish the same things here. Maybe we're not paid enough, or I don't know, but we are very cautious with the cost, which makes it more interesting for VCs and retail investors because there's a possibility to actually fund these companies. I would also just mention the history from the large pharmas that we've had. It's been kind of the basis to make this work. Plus, the last thing, if not least, which you also pointed out, is the access to capital from the MTFs, the First North and so on. I think that's also quite unique. We don't see that elsewhere in the world. So those are really key things.
Thank you, Per. Let's stay on the note of finance. This is obviously what we're talking primarily here about. But many years of low interest rates and good access also to capital has led to an increased interest from foreign actors, most recently Elos Medtech and also Sobi. Would you say, is this good for the Swedish life science sector, or can it be seen as negative that the Swedish research, the brain drain that has been transferred abroad? Who would like to answer this?
Yes, I can start. I mean, the capital markets are international, and also for listed companies, there's a quite diverse owner structure with foreign investors and so on. Both Swedish and foreign private equity firms see an interest in this sector, and I think it's quite healthy to have a sort of balance. Some companies come to the stock market with IPOs, and some leaves. Having said that, I think many companies, I mean, the reason for acquiring a company is not. It's more to develop the company in a way that hasn't been done to that point. But I think it would be possible to develop these companies also on the stock market as long as the investors understand the journey the company is on. So I think it's, but from an industry perspective, I think it's, I mean, there is an example of Uppsala where they acquired Pharmacia, and that was devastating for that company, but good for the environment in Uppsala. It has never been better, actually.
Same thing happened in Lund, actually.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, we know this.
Yeah.
So would you like to add?
No, it's interesting. I worked for the last 6 years in the Danish pharmaceutical industry, and there you have, of course, still several large pharmaceutical companies based in Denmark, and it's quite clear that of course it's really beneficial for that area and for bringing up new businesses, and of course the long-term ownership structure that those companies have. There are several of them are owned by foundations that have very stable ownership that allows them to take long-term bets and so forth. And that's of course very, very beneficial for that area. But I completely agree that it's very difficult to rebuild something like that now. It's probably unrealistic to aim for something like that. But I can just see in Denmark it's of course very, very advantageous for them. But I agree it's an international market now, so it's hard to reconstruct something like that.
Per, would you like to add?
No, I think you pointed out the things. I'm comparing to other industries, and if we go to looking at how we develop this industry going forward, you need the big pharmas and the big medtechs, because it's like in automotive, you have OEMs, and they actually provide a stability in long term, as you point out. You have the same thing in forestry in Sweden. Pharma is no exception. For the ecosystem, you need these big companies to actually drive the creation of an industry. So it's long-term not good that they disappear, and we need to rebuild, even if I agree it's difficult. I don't think it's impossible. There's so much innovation going on, but it takes time. But it's not a catastrophe, and the markets, they rule. So I don't think we can really change it that easily.
How about how Swedish main owners should respond in reasons of short-term profit-taking versus long-term value creation? What do you say, Per?
I mean, you can always wish for long-term stable owners who actually look at developing the infrastructure for the industry, and there are a few players like that in Sweden. But it's also you have to understand each owner has their own business model. And
Speaking of the markets, yes. Mm.
Yes, and I mean, normally you have very few who can actually take part in all stages of development of these companies. It's kind of a stafette.
Relay.
Relay, thank you.
You're welcome.
But as soon as they get up to a certain level and maturity, it would be really helpful if you had long-term investors and foundations possibly, or family offices rather. Those are the ones who might take on that role.
Can you share any good examples?
Well, in Denmark, Novo, the foundation, you have Wallenberg has been a very helpful Industrivärden as well. But I mean, those with a bit more long-term view, I think there are others. I would hope that the pension funds could step in a bit longer, but they are very financially driven. And I haven't seen it really to a large extent that they stay on for a very long time.
Would you like to share perspectives on this one, too?
Yeah, I mean, Per mentioned different types of owners. I think that's important to understand when we have the retail investors and they are short-term oriented. They don't take any responsibility, of course. And then there are very long-term owners, as we talked about as well, and they have to take the long-term perspective. And then there is the institutional fund managers and so on. And they also have a responsibility towards the investors to sort of get returns. So they I mean, are in between. I mean, they have to have returns, but they should also take responsibility, I think, as major owners and so on. So there is a balance, and it's not very clear for all these roles what they should do in any given situation. But it is a dynamic situation, and I think it's interesting.
Yeah, I completely agree. Not much to add.
Good. So let's talk about IPO. It's an investment alternative for life science companies in earlier stages. But from your perspective, and I'm turning to you now, how much do you look at companies in earlier stages before licensing to big pharma?
It's probably more a question to the panelists.
But I want your perspective, because it's a little bit from the side. So
yeah, so well, I don't look at companies in that way and so on. But I think again, I think there is a huge opportunity for companies that are somehow helping us to solve. I think the main issue with pharmaceutical development today is the cost it takes for us to develop the evidence. And I think the companies that are working with technologies for measuring the outcomes we're interested in a more efficient way, in a more precise way. It can be things like biomarkers, it can be digital signals or phenotypes and things like that. It can also be, for example, during Corona, we mentioned here before the effect of the Corona pandemic and that had on clinical development, and the immediate need for moving towards more remote trial monitoring. That's really accelerated the uptake of those type of technologies. We've shown that you can actually monitor clinical trials using digital technologies. You don't have to have the physical visits to the doctor's office, and that, of course, is an enormous opportunity to reduce costs for development. I think companies that are able to, both the technology providers and the service companies, but also the biotech companies that are able to fully capitalize on those type of developments, I think it's a really interesting opportunity.
Thank you for sharing your perspective. I wanted you to start, actually, because it's a little bit different angle. So, Per.
On the IPO, if we look at that before licensing, we always go for a dual process. That means an IPO, preparing for an IPO, if we're at that value inflection point where it's likely that that will be successful. Or we look at an exit as a trade sale. From a venture capital perspective, that's what you would normally do, to have the both alternatives and see what plays out the best. And it's also, I mean, from our perspective, we don't see the stock market as an exit. It's more a way to fund the company. So if we don't manage to sell the company, it's a good way to help finance it for the next stage and take it to the next inflection value point. So that's how we look at that. Having said that, it's incredible to have this First North market or the other MTFs, Spotlight and NGM. At the same time, it's very retail driven for these small companies, and it complicates things for the valuation of the company later on if you want to sell it. And also, if you have delays, you will be hurt a lot. So ideally, they should stay private for a bit longer. But having said that, it's extraordinary to be able to have money coming into these companies when you need it also.
When you say stay private longer, in an average, the number of years, what do you see as sort of the perfect
if you look at
timeline?
pharma, you can normally sell a pharma company with successful data coming out of phase 2A or B. That's when you sell them normally, if they're good enough. So you need to take them to that stage. And if you want to move even further, which you might be able to do in orphan drugs or such companies, you need to fund them for the phase 3 trials as well. In medtech, you need to take them to about 200 million turnover or something before you can sell them. So that's where you have the option to sell or stay on the market, on the listed market.
Björn?
Yeah, I mean, and I agree. Certain level of maturity is good for the company. Many of the professional investors don't have time or the skill, competence to evaluate these early companies, and frankly, there is not enough data to really dig into. I mean, at early stage, you don't know how the drug works or something like that. And that means that retail investors, private persons, are going to be important shareholders, and that is sometimes a challenge. I think the largest challenge is when expectations becomes too high, because that it's good for the share price, and it makes it easier to make I mean further capital raises, but it's sort of it's difficult for the really professional investors to invest in a good company when valuation is too high. So you have to set reasonable expectations, and it's a challenge to find those reasonable levels without the knowledge and understanding of the risks and everything involved, and also capital requirements.
Well, knowledge is key as always, and this is partially why we're here, of course, to learn more about these companies. But staying with you, Björn, what advice can you give to people that are looking to invest in the life science sector from your experience?
I mean, apart from the normal stock market advice, it's extremely important in this sector to do your homework, to understand what you invest in. So I mean, going to days like this and listen to companies and media and analysts and so on, but don't trust anyone. Make your own decisions. See what is reasonable and what do you believe, because you're going to need that conviction also later on when things change and so on. So that's and I mean more general. There are a lot of uncertainties in many companies, so spread the risk to different companies. So yeah, it's.
Trust no one, huh? That's tricky.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, do your own homework.
Per, do you follow that advice? Trust no one?
I think you're spot on. It's a very risky business. Risks all over the place, biological as well as execution
There's
risk.
also always the flip side on the risk, of course.
Yes, there is also a huge upside, of course, which makes the equation go together if you're a bit diversified, which you pointed out as well. So I could not agree more than you really need to understand the science, the people, which is key in these phases, and have a diversified portfolio and also have a long-term view. So one advice would be to look at Karolinska development as an investment. No, just joking.
Of course. So Linus, from your platform as a scientist, can you share advice? I mean, you trust no one. You have the background of a scientist, and what is your advice?
No, it's absolutely right. I mean, I think one fallacy is to kind of have simple rules, for example, based on previous regulatory approvals. I think that those will hold forever. I mean, this is always a changing environment. For example, the whole paradigm of focusing very much on the regulatory approval as the end point, that's no longer very useful, because we've seen, for example, with the Biogen drug that was mentioned before here, that have managed to get a regulatory approval, but now, of course, they have challenges to get really these sales to take off, because they have immense problems getting this drug reimbursed and arguing for the value and that this drug actually does anything for the patients, because the regulatory thresholds have been lowered so much. So you know, you have to always think about what does it take to take this product all the way to the patient, including all these reimbursement steps and so forth. So focusing too much on the regulatory approval, I think, is one of these things that can lead you wrong.
But to stay updated, can you recommend any specific go-tos to read? For instance, any publications, any platforms that you find are more sort of solid and based on science than others?
Well, I think there's so much. I think Stat is a good site. There's a lot of good updates on it. But yeah, there are many. Yeah.
Would you like to add, Björn or Per?
No, I mean,
or sources for information.
No, I mean, be curious and read and listen and gather information of the specific companies that you're interested in.
And Karolinska development.
No, but actually, for each area is so specific. So and you can't know everything. So I would actually say that you can trust some people and go out and ask the ones who actually knows and have done it before in that area, and get your own view.
So look for experience. Is that what you say?
Exactly.
Well, thank you for sharing your experience here on the stage, and to the people here at Grand Hotel at the Naventus Life Science Summit, and of course all the viewers behind the screens at home or at the offices. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.